While Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron were in the White House yesterday talking about how they're going to end the war in Ukraine and some of the terms and conditions that may facilitate the end of the war, you had another meeting going on of European leaders in Kyiv where they seem to be more focused on how they can keep the war going. And we're going to try and figure some of this out and really kind of what is going on here and why so many Europeans seem to be pulled in multiple directions. And we've got back with us today Patrick Henningsen, geopolitical analyst, journalist, and host of the SundayWire.com. Patrick, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be with you, Daniel.
Well, listen, this situation here is just kind of bizarre because, I mean, you've got Trump ever since you can really go back to 2023. It was one of the first times I remember when he's talking about if elected, he's going to end the Russia-Ukraine war in a day, he famously said, and then he won the election. And then he started saying, okay, well, maybe not a day, maybe it'll take a little bit longer than that. And then shortly after he got inaugurated, he said, well, okay, maybe 100 days, but still, it's going to come to an end. And now here, I want to say it was Sunday, you had Caroline Leavitt, the White House spokesman, say maybe a deal could be arranged in a week. Mike Waltz, this national security advisor, said on Monday morning, maybe a week or two. And then Trump himself said maybe a few weeks. So the time comes getting slow. Everything they're talking about is about ending this war. And then you go over to Kyiv, where all these European leaders were meeting, saying something different. What is your understanding of why the disconnect between the two poles?
Well, the preconditions for ending the conflict for Ukraine, they actually just passed in the Ukrainian parliament in the Rada a vote of confidence for Zelensky as the president out of his mandate now since May of last year. But the first vote that went through, they rejected it. So clearly there was some behind the scenes maneuvering. I'm sure some European officials were directly involved in, swinging certain Ukrainian parliamentary members to give a vote of confidence to Zelensky. But they're basically, within their statement, they're blaming Putin for not being able to have elections in Ukraine. So it's blaming Russia, and it creates a kind of vicious cycle because Russia's said they can't really ink a permanent deal until Ukraine has elections. Ukraine saying we can't have elections until we win, until Russia's defeated, and they're still blaming Putin for not allowing them to have elections. So it's setting it up for like the status quo in the midterm. In the short
and midterm. And I keep hearing that over and over because Trump famously last week, or infamously, depending on your perspective, said Zelensky was a dictator without an election, and he wanted that to get resolved. And obviously, that's Russia saying the same thing, that they said until that happens, we can negotiate with Zelensky, we can't sign a deal with him, no matter what. I mean, that seems to be their position, at least at this point. And I was watching earlier, and unfortunately, I can't recall who it was, but it was one of the Ukrainian ambassadors that was talking to a UK interviewer, and he was just incredulous at the idea of asking them to hold an election in the middle of wartime while they're having this conflict here. And he said, who would ever do such a thing? And the first thing that come to my mind was Vladimir Putin, because in the same year that Zelensky was supposed to have an election, Russia did. Or maybe, I don't know, the United States. In the middle of our civil war, we had a presidential election. So I guess there is some precedence, but yet everyone wants to hide behind that as long as there's the martial law, according to their constitution, they can't have a presidential election. But what would stop them from just canceling the martial law and having an election?
Zelensky kind of finds himself in the same position as Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. They both need the war to go on in order to stay in power. The war stops when there's a sigh of where people can catch their breath, and nationally, collectively, they're out of power. I mean, that's just kind of obvious. So this is not a good situation. The worst part about this, of course, is the fact that the Europeans are putting all their support behind Zelensky, so giving their full-throated support to pledges of money and arms and so forth. So the noises coming out of Europe are they want to keep the conflict going. The UK as well. This has oddly brought the UK back together with Europe post-Brexit in a way that it's like all past differences are mended now, and they're all sort of speaking with one unified European voice. This may even lead to a segue of Britain coming back into Europe via some kind of association agreement that might come up in the next general election with Keir Starmer running on that divisive point.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, you can rip apart your internal cohesion if you do that in Europe and UK, but I guess that's a separate issue.
Yeah, no, this is on the cards with Starmer 100%. So this is actually working in his favor at the moment by joining with Europe and being closer to Europe. But you can't be enemies with the United States on this for very long. So I think, like you said, the timelines are being stretched with the U.S. I think that's inevitable because it's a lot more complex than maybe they thought it would be. And with Ukraine and Europe now giving a lot of resistance, it might be longer. But the important thing for Washington is they're pushing things in the right direction. So eventually, I think it's going to net positive. But the danger here is if Europe gets a little too aggressive and too cocky and too provocative, they could cause a war with Russia and then drag the United States later into a conflict. And let's be honest, it's not the first time that type of scenario has happened in modern history. So it is a risk down the road because we are dealing with let's face it, it's very irrational, the arguments coming from Europe, very emotional, not
okay. Yeah. And in fact, I want to jump to that because I want to show some graphic evidence of exactly what you're talking about here. And let's start, first of all, with the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who lays out a very interesting argument.
Ukraine continues to endure with courage that does not falter, hope that does not fade, and a spirit that cannot be broken. NATO has stood with Ukraine throughout Russia's brutal war of aggression to keep the flame of freedom burning. We have kept Ukraine strong by providing arms, equipment, and training. The bravery and resilience of the Ukrainian people are an inspiration to the world. NATO will continue to support and stand with Ukraine and help it through the challenges ahead to ensure this war can end with a just and lasting peace.
I want to talk about several things off that one clip there. First of all, like the first 2/3 of it were just one bumper sticker after another. There was no substance to any of them, and it's an inspiration to the world, and they have continued to resist and all this kind of stuff. And that stuff briefs well, and it plays well in Western media circles. But is there a relation between what he's saying and ground truth?
Well, the ground truth is that Eurocrats are quite happy to, support this conflict as long as they're not sacrificing any of their men. Right down to the last Ukrainian. And you notice all the watchwords, the buzzwords like full-scale invasion. You can't, if you're from the West, you can't talk about this conflict without putting the prefix on Putin's unprovoked war, Putin's war of choice, a full-scale invasion by Russia. This is total gaslighting, but there's a method to this madness because this is the same type of language that you saw European countries sticking to Germany after the First World War because they were trying to build up the case for reparations. And what's interesting is the reparations that the package and what was due and things like that, it's very similar in dollar amount to what the Europeans have confiscated from Russia dollar reserve assets, which are held in Euroclear right now, upwards of like $300 billion. It's not dissimilar to that amount that countries like Germany would have been stuck with after the First World War. So there's a reason why you're seeing this language. They're building up a case, historical case to blame Russia, but this isn't working because the United States, the Trump administration, has just thrown a spanner right into their wheel on this. So they're going to have to, this is the problem, Daniel, is that if the United States has rapprochement with Moscow, that means that Europe is safe at that point. I mean, as long as the America and Moscow are on good terms and have normalized relations, why would Europe feel threatened? Why would their existential security feel threatened? But at the same time, the U.S. is pushing them to spend 5% of GDP on defense. So like from that doesn't necessarily make sense. It's like the protection racket, but no protection, just, pay. So I think at some point, the US and Europe are going to have a realistic conversation about what is the nature of the threat and why is the threat there. And quite clearly, the problem is NATO. and NATO aggression. I think people in Washington understand this. Many of the people in Trump's orbit, Steve Witkoff, has intimated as much, but I don't see that admission coming from Europe, which is odd because they're the junior partners in NATO and the US is the senior partner. They're going against the senior partner. They're like the office staff that has been well behaved for the longest time. As Thomas Fassi, a great journalist, said, Europe was employee of the month for 3 years, and all of a sudden the management's taken a new direction and they're rebelling against the management. So
yeah, that's definitely a lot of changes going on. Another thing that I wanted to talk about what he said there, because I think it kind of tells into what our theme is for this show itself, is that he said we want to help Ukraine endure, but nowhere do I hear anything in there where he's talking about how he's going to bring the war diplomatically to an end. I'm going to hold off on the phrase he used at the minute for a just and diplomatic solution, but first of all the things he's talking about are all military support. All the things that were given and pledged throughout this conference all had to do with more military support to allow them to continue fighting, to give them ammunition, more weapon systems, more infantry fighting vehicles, etc. How do those two things go together? And why is Europe wanting to extend the war as opposed to trying to find the best way to get it ended quickly?
I think the bottom line here is the Europeans have sunk so much political capital and reputations into this conflict. I mean, even the new Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, he's been a hawk on Ukraine all along, although he's pulled short of wanting to put European peacekeeping troops on Ukrainian soil, but they've all gone all in on this. And I think that a lot of these political parties and leaders are at risk of completely losing credibility with their electorate. I mean, you could see a number of governments completely falter. And of course, that's going to open the door for a surgence of populist right-wing parties, for instance, in some European countries. So this is like an existential crisis for Europe. And it's also for NATO as well. And I'm a little bit worried about how deeply they're into this problem, because if they don't, Ukraine is an unstable electron, to steal a term from Jeffrey Pyatt, I think, an unstable electron, and they could kick up real problems if they feel like they're being abandoned by the United States. And we're very close to Europe. You have very radical neo-Nazi elements of the Ukrainian armed forces. And even Zelensky or whoever comes in to take over the government, they might very well be beholden to ultra-radical nationalists. And that's going to be even more difficult to bring this thing to a close. And you might even have a civil war or a splinter, another wing of the civil war breaking out in Ukraine because of this change and this instability. So there's a lot of potential problems here. If the United States and Europe are not working together, there are a whole lot of problems that could arise.
Okay, and that brings me to the last point on that video I want to talk about. The last thing he said there was, we're looking for a just and lasting peace. But what I have never heard, not in this conference, not in any other forum in the European Union where people have been saying this kind of thing, is what they think that looks like. Now, you may recall that up until maybe around midsummer of last year, they were still some kind of fictitious, we're eventually going to push Russia back to the 1991 borders. Well, they finally abandoned that. And then in the fall, for the first time, without any explanation, Zelensky's talking about, okay, well, a fair peace and some kind of negotiated settlement. That's the first time he started using that. He never defined what his version of a negotiated settlement looks like. What is the West even shooting for, if you can articulate any such a thing? What do they think a just and lasting peace looks like?
No, you're correct, Daniel. This has not been clearly articulated by Europe. This idea that, well, we're gonna arm them is like the Lindsey Graham line. Those brave, feisty Ukrainians, we're gonna send them weapons as long as they're willing to fight. We're gonna send them whatever they want. It's up to them. It's not our war. We're not losing any men. The Europeans are kind of adopting this position without articulating what is the end game, what is the end state of this operation, which they're about to inherit, because this is like potentially hands off by the United States. The Europeans inherit it. They have to have a roadmap. They have to demand elections. They're not putting any pressure on Kyiv. The Trump administration's put more pressure for elections on Kyiv than Europe has. So this is really a potential disaster. And one of the other big problems is this hate of Russia, that's developed in Europe. The irony of this, Daniel, is that this came from Russiagate initially. This enmity between Europe and Russia wasn't so manifest before Russiagate. And what the U.S. have done through successive administrations, Obama, the Trump administration, along with the Democrats who had control of the House, then the Biden administration, they've created such anti-Russian hate. Now the U.S. is backing off, and the U.S. is wanting to normalize relations. Europe is like still all in on the anti-Russian hate. So in a way, I can see if the U.S.'s grand strategy executing offshore balancing, which is clearly what Trump is intending to do. It's what Trump wanted to do in his first term. And Stephen Walt, John Mearsheimer will tell you what offshore balancing is. It's relying on your local partners to do the enforcement in the heavy lifting, and the U.S. will provide various other supports, but at arm's length, and then reshoring their major assets. So this is clearly what Trump is attempting to do, and they've kind of got having Europe at such adversarial position with Russia kind of works for the United States if they're wanting to execute an offshore balancing foreign policy going forward, which is a very risky move actually by Trump. Many administrations have tried to do this. Obama tried, and it was disastrous with the war in Yemen, working through Saudi Arabia to execute that war in the UAE. This was a disaster. So it's a very difficult high wire.
Well, I would actually argue that the concept itself is perfectly valid. It's, if you, like any tool, if you misuse it, it's going to backfire, which is, I think, is exactly what Obama did. That should never have been used. The offshore balancing, in my view, should only be used for our national security interests, not for loaning out to Saudi Arabia. But I digress. You mentioned, and I just have to show it here, you mentioned Lindsey Graham, because he's also in the mix of this, and here's a version of what he said, like you mentioned.
Here's what I think is going to happen. I think he's going to find a way to end this war in a fashion that Putin would be a fool to do it again. Very quickly. How do you deter Putin? You arm this guy to the teeth. Yeah, you give him a bunch of F-16s, not a few F-16s. You give him ATACMS, you give him tanks, because they will fight. Remind me not to invade Ukraine, okay?
Okay, let's just examine that a little bit. So if all we got to do is give Ukraine more tanks and F-16s and infantry fighting vehicles, then that's going to deter Putin. Can you make that work for me after 2023?
This is a failing strategy. You know, Americans should study Operation Barbarossa, and they should study Operation Bagration. And these are the conflicts that took place on this same site many, many decades ago in World War II. And look at how Russia prosecutes ground wars on their doorstep. It hasn't changed. They adapt. They fall behind. They retrench. They adapt. They innovate. This is what Russia has done. They have won what are arguably the greatest battles in the history of warfare, Operation Bagration. As an example, we don't study that. And if you ask any buddy in Washington, what are the top most important battles of the Second World War, they'll say, the D-Day, Normandy, Battle of the Bulge, etc. But they don't talk a lot about the Eastern Front, and that's exactly what we're seeing here. Russia is in for the long haul, and they will do whatever it takes. They have the materials, they have the men, they have the strategic depth, and that's how they defeated Nazi Germany. And that's no small feat. You're talking about millions of men being thrown at each other. And so Russia has experience. They know exactly what they're doing. They're patient. They're willing to take losses for what is their national security interest. But NATO is not willing to take any losses for their interests. And what are their interests? NATO expansion. What's the EU's interest? EU expansion. So who are the real imperialists here? And I think this would be the end of NATO expansion.
There's really not much more place to go at any point. But I want to zero back in on one last thing he said, because it's also an inextricable part of the calculation of this whole thing, is that Graham said, these Ukrainians, they'll fight. You just got to give them the stuff. But Patrick, I'm looking at casualty figures, And I'm looking at the mobilization process. I'm looking at General Syrskyi, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian ground forces, who has said that they cannot even force mobilize enough people to offset losses per month. So ergo, they are shrinking, and the Russian army is expanding. Make those two things work for me.
Yeah, but the West, the strategy from the West, when this all started, Dan, you remember, it was that Russia's not going to last. They're not going to make it. We're going to sanction them, and it's like when what the British said. I think Churchill said, or Hitler. Oh, sorry, Hitler said in Second World War, we just have to kick the door down, and the Soviet Union society will collapse. And that's kind of like our attitude at the beginning of this conflict is once we sanction Russia and we put some pressure on them, they're going to collapse from inside. Putin won't last through the next year. And of course, the opposite's true. Their economy is thriving. So they're ready to go for the long haul. There's no amount of weaponry that the West, that the United States, even if Biden had a second term, there's no amount of support and weaponry, but it'll bankrupt us anyway in the West. But there's no amount of support they can do to change the trends, the clear trends of this conflict. And for Ukraine, they will risk really imploding, not just militarily, but the government, society. You're already seeing marches, by the way, in Ukraine. And I think this is because of President Trump has opened up a conversation that is now flooded into Ukraine, where people are feeling a little more emboldened to have an opinion about their family members being impressed into military service by Zelensky's thugs. That's because of Trump, and the United States have taken a bold move. That's inspiring more Ukrainians than there are Ukrainians being inspired to want to fight in a losing war. This trend is irreversible now. So the longer this goes on, I think you're going to see more dissent within Ukrainian society, and people like Lindsey Graham are going to be exposed and seen for what they are, which is absolute charlatans who have not a moral bone in their body to be advocating for such a losing cause.
Well, that can't come soon enough for the Ukrainians who are still alive, I'll point out. But, earlier in the war, you could give maybe 10%. I gave them maybe 10% periodically for some people to think, well, if we just give them enough stuff, they can turn it out. They can turn this around because of their fighting and their heroic actions and whatever. Okay, you could have made that for a while. Even then, I argued against it. I said it wasn't valid even then. But okay, somebody who doesn't know, and they think what's theoretically possible. Well, 2023 eliminated that possibility and showed that there was no percent, and it was not going to happen. The war should have ended there. Well, should have ended many times before, but at the very latest, after you proved you couldn't change the reality on the ground with offensive force, now it's time to close it off. But despite all of those lessons and everything through the entire calendar 2024, where Russia just methodically has been moving, even if at a relatively slow pace, territorial, the casualty count on the Ukraine side has continued to just dwarf, which in my view, that's Russia's objective, not territorial acquisition per se, but the destruction of the armed forces of the Ukraine, which they're moving towards. But what you can't defend, or at least I have a hard time defending, is how current leaders today keep saying stuff like something that you put on an X post, I think today on Lammy from the UK. And he was talking about how put this basically kind of a commercial out. Gary, if you can throw that up there, this is what you posted earlier, and you can see the it's kind of like a really slick video, and we can't play it out loud here because there's music on it and that would get us defunded and stuff. But he's using all this marketing skills and whatnot. What do you make of this, and how can he make these kinds of comments to encourage people to keep on supporting Ukraine, to encourage Ukraine to keep throwing their men out into these losing battles? How do you view it?
This is just an emotion. This is an emotive propaganda film. I mean, look at the slickness of the production, dramatic lighting, sort of cinematography, and so forth. This is the kind of same type of stuff that Zelensky is releasing as well to try to keep people motivated, keep people on side for this conflict. And it's kind of like it's very shallow. I think it's incredibly fake, but I also think it's quite crass because it's putting up this idea that the Ukrainians have to keep fighting those Russians. They have to die for our collective ego in the West, or the vanity of NATO, which is a hugely problematic organization now, especially now after these 3 years. And so you see this delusional propaganda. I think Putin said he said they're saying things that have no practical, that don't make any practical sense. This is the problem in Europe and Britain. So the things that there's tropes, is a whole string of tropes that they're using that don't correspond to facts on the ground. Nobody's interested in the truth anymore. And this is a very dangerous, this is where countries really go down hard in history. If they're that divorced, the leadership gets that divorced from reality, it usually ends in tears, and it ends badly. And that could happen here.
And in fact, it's not just the UK. I wish it were, because then the damage might be limited. But from that same meeting that was in Kyiv, where I told you all these European leaders, and one of the other ones was Danish Prime Minister Frederiksen, who, wow, thinks that NATO membership might be the easiest path forward for Ukraine.
This war is about Russia. It's about the imperial dreams, and therefore I find it very difficult to trust Putin and to trust Russia. And it goes without saying that nothing should be negotiated without Ukraine, not only at the table, but in the center of the table, of course. We need to ensure Ukraine has a real and strong security guarantee. NATO membership is, of course, the strongest security guarantee. It is the easiest way forward. It's the cheapest way forward. I know that some allies are against this. And therefore, I ask the question, if we cannot give you membership of NATO, and I think it's the only way forward, then we have to find another way to provide Ukraine with a clear, long-term security guarantee. The best things about heroes is that they always win at the end. And if they aren't winning, then it's not the end. My guess is that we have a couple of months to take all necessary decisions. Otherwise, we'll be too late. So it's time to stand up for Ukraine, and it's time to stand up for Europe.
Wow, where to even begin there? I'm going to choose to begin with that comment that I said. You talk about slick and I think morally bankrupt comments. The good guy heroes always win, and if the heroes aren't winning, then it's time to keep fighting. So yes, to your comment a second ago, to the last Ukrainian, how many more Ukrainian men have to die before you're convinced that their hero status is valid?
It's like a Marvel comic movie or something. The heroes always win. And this is a small, minor country, Denmark, in terms of the size of its military prowess, its geopolitical influence. But this is what you have in Europe. It's kind of a free-for-all that the big daddy has left the room, and you can kind of see them like it's Lord of the Flies at the moment in Brussels.
Oh man!
so it won't be long until they turn on each other, because there is tribal enmity between some European members, and in the vacuum of power from the United States, you will see some games. You're not seeing it yet, but you will be. But let's be real, Daniel. NATO membership. Are they going to get a vote from the United States in the next 4 years for Ukraine to join NATO? I don't think so. Are they going to get a vote from Viktor Orban in Hungary? No. Are they going to get a vote from Slovakia? No, not with the current leadership. And I can name 2 other or 3 other NATO member states that might be on the fence on this, okay, including Spain and maybe Turkey. The U.S. could very easily lean on Turkey. They could lean on them saying, we're going to be friends with Russia and Syria. And all of a sudden, they could they could spin Erdogan like a whirling dervish, so it's what the European powers think they're doing here. They're really going up against a wall, because the NATO thing is an unstarted. Steve Witkoff himself said, we like the Istanbul Agreement from March 2022. We're going to use that as a roadmap, obviously without Donbass. That's a non-starter. Those are gone, the regions in the east. So the U.S. is already basically starting to retrace the steps, all the missteps of the Biden administration, and they're learning very quick. I'm very encouraged by some of the things that have been said by the Trump administration, that they understand the process that has taken place, and including the Minsk Accords. I'm starting to see it in their language. They're not going. That's the only way they can have a conversation with Russia. You might even see a situation, Daniel, where the Trump administration, a light bulb might go off, and they're thinking, wow, in the future, wouldn't it be great to have a rare earth mineral deal with Russia? the world's largest baskets commodity producer,
Yeah.
and forget about all these small countries. We're just going to do our resource deals with the biggest guy in Eurasia. I mean, Trump's going to look at this, and his team are looking at it very differently than previous administrations. So where's
Or
that
anybody else in Europe?
they're doing the Henry Kissinger model. If China is the potential rival, then you have to make friends with Russia. This is triangular diplomacy 101. And I can't believe that the Europeans aren't working this out, because they better, because this could go really badly for them, because they also need to have good relations with some of these countries. Is it better to have Europe to be more friendly with Russia, or to have direct trade with China? So how's this? This is very interesting how this is gonna play out, Daniel. I mean,
Yeah.
right now it's a bit of a mess right now.
Oh,
So
that's an understatement. It's a huge mess. One of the things she said in there, I want to ask your opinion on, because she said it in this comment here, but it's stuff that I hear all over the place in the West, and certainly in Kyiv. And that she said there will be no discussions about Ukraine without Ukraine. Ukraine has to be at the center of the table. I haven't seen any evidence that Trump is considering maybe not even having Zelensky on the table, much less at the center of it. You may recall that I believe it was last week in the Munich Security Conference, where General Kellogg was pressed at a panel by a European host, and said, "Wait a minute, are you saying that there's only going to be two protagonists at these discussions? It's the United States and Europe, and Russia and Europe, and Ukraine's not even going to be at the table?" And he goes, "Yeah, pretty much. That's what we're saying here." So why would you think that we would not want to put Ukraine at the center of the table when it comes to negotiating an end with Russia?
Well, firstly, I'm going to say the deployment of General Kellogg, because if I'm reading it, they sent him out as a complete decoy. And if that was the strategy, it was brilliant. He kept the media, he kept Europe basically on their back heels, confused and scrambled why they went and started talks with Russia. So if that was the strategy from the White House, it worked a charm, because he did a brilliant job in shuffling the deck on Europe. But in terms of, yeah, I mean, it's gonna come down in the end to Ukraine. You have to be able to know that you're going to be talking, to have a serious discussion with the person who's going to be in power for the next 4-5 years minimum in Ukraine. And that is not Zelensky. And if Europe thinks that's going to be Zelensky, fine, we're back to the status quo. But it's a worse status quo than with the U.S. backing the Ukrainian military. You take the U.S. support away, this is not a good prospect for Ukraine. So that's what it's a downgraded status quo. That's where we're headed on this. And who's going to benefit from that? Russia's going to benefit from that. So,
and and just frankly, just practically speaking, if you know that the guy that sank the Istanbul agreement that was on the table in 2022, if you talk about the guy that refused to have any kind of a negotiated settlement with Russia during the Minsk agreements, or in the December 2021 offer that Putin made, another opportunity to avoid war, he rejected that. He rejected having any kind of negotiations after 2023's failed offensive, and he refused last June when Putin made yet another opportunity here. If he has rejected peace every single time, and he's now asking for NATO membership and nuclear weapons, why would you want that guy at the table when you're trying to end the war?
Worse than that, when he ran for president in 2019 Ukraine, he promised two big campaign promises that helped to give him a landslide win. One of them was he was going to have an investigation to find out who the Maidan Square snipers were in February of 2014. He never did that. Then he said, we're going to bring peace to the eastern regions. I'm going to mend the divisions. There's going to be no discrimination of Russian speakers, and we're going to implement the Minsk Accords. That didn't happen. So, like, really, even before he became president, he has not come good on his promises to his own electorate. So, and you've just pointed out the string of broken opportunities and missed opportunities and broken promises that Zelensky has presided over. There is no way that Russia will take him seriously as a counterparty. And if Russia is not going to take him seriously, there's going to be no deal. And then you're back to square one again. And I honestly think I don't I think what's going to happen, Daniel, is this might be a painful process for like the next 2 years. There needs to be regime change in Europe. There needs to be at least 1 or 2 major European countries that either change their mind on this, or the government gets thrown out in the upcoming elections that are happening. And that's the only way I think Europe's going to be able to pull themselves out of this. So
we've certainly been seeing that move for quite a while now. I mean, it's been 6 months or so when going to the European Union Parliament elections, the German elections, French elections. I mean, you see that it's moving in that direction. So if they want to continue winning elections, they better start changing to represent their people.
I'll tell you something else is interesting too. Friedrich Merz, he might be the most Americanized German chancellor in history. He spent a lot of time in America. He's very familiar with American politics, culture, and business. He is a bit of a maverick in terms of German politics. He's been very hawkish on the wars up to this point, but once you get in office and you start realizing the practical implications of everything, he might change. And he's somebody that I think, this is my instinct, that he could communicate with the United States administration much more effectively than the previous German leadership. So I have not canceled out my hope that there might be a door open with Friedrich Merz and Donald Trump. And if that happens, everything changes at that point.
Yeah, we'll have to see how that works out. Certainly would love to see it. Anything that's going to bring this war to a close and get us back to living in any kind of stability is something I'm enthusiastically support. I've been mentioning here a lot of stuff about what's going on in Europe and how they seem to extend the war. They don't want to acknowledge any reality, and they don't even talk about peace. I showed you U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham a second ago. Well, his Democratic counterpart, Chuck Schumer, is in the same boat.
Let's not forget, America. Maybe there are some who say enough already. If we give in to Putin now, America will inevitably pay the price later. That's what history has shown. When you give in to thugs, when you give in to dictators, you pay the price. Hasn't Donald Trump and his allies learned the lessons of history? This struggle is in every way about the ultimate security of the American people.
Hasn't anyone learned? I'm sorry. That just baffles me how otherwise intelligent people can actually think that American national security interests are at stake if Russia gets its way. And even more fundamentally, and I'd like your view on this, because this is another thing I hear a lot of places, both in the U.S. and in Europe, is that, well, we can't give in to Putin. We can't hand him over stuff because that's just giving in to the dictators, and dictators around the world will be watching this kind of thing. And I'm like, fellas, look, you're not giving Putin anything. Trump will not give Putin anything. Putin has the cards right now. He has the territory. He has earned it in combat and through a lot of blood, and he has all of the capabilities and the raw materials to take a lot more. So if we don't end in this bad deal right here, Putin could just continue fighting, and it would be a horrible deal.
So what Chuck Schumer has just demonstrated there is a dumbed down version of the domino theory. It's like the most dumbed down version of the domino theory you could possibly do. The same argument was made about communism domino theory, but at least there might have been some credence to that because you actually had, a Cold War going on. So this is the democracy domino theory that the Democrats ran on. What he just said there, Daniel, was taken as gospel a couple of years ago. But see, this is about ideas and power. It's the same bad ideas, but guess what? Chuck Schumer is no longer in power. So you don't see that strong, authoritative head of the Senate. What you see is a completely weak and bamboozled opposition with his shirt tail practically coming out from his trousers. There is kind of pathetic, making a speech to an empty room. I mean, this is what the opposition do. So that shows you the difference if the ideas are good, they can transcend whether you're in opposition or you're in leadership. But if the ideas are bad, they only work when you have power. And the Democrats don't have it.
They don't. And I think one of the ramifications of these kinds of things in these statements, whether from the Danish Prime Minister or Mark Rutte, Schumer, Graham, etc., is that the impact it has on Zelensky, because it keeps giving him a lifeline, thinking he's going to win. You also had an ex post on Zelensky here that basically, Gary, if you can throw that one up there, because I want to show exactly what Patrick wrote. No, not that one. The one with the tweet or the ex post. Yeah, that one right there. You say 3 years of needlessly sacrificing a generation of Ukrainian men in an unwinnable war for the sake of Western vanity. And here again, there's like a really slick video production on there, which we can show you without the audio, but you can see it's just marketing. And what led you to write this?
Well, this is Zelensky's highlight reel of the last 3 years. You know, glory to Ukraine. And my point here is, where's the glory in 500,000 plus, you know, a whole generation of Ukrainian boys and men, even grandfathers killed on the front line? Where's the glory in this if the inevitable result is a loss, if the inevitable result is surrender? So you wouldn't be seeing this if they weren't being injected with steroids from the West. And so you've got this, you know, the Ukrainian military, Zelensky is like that little guy in the gym who's winning all the powerlifting competitions in his weight class because he's pumped up with anabolic steroids. But the minute he's off steroids, he's just another little guy. And he's able to punch above his weight for a while, but not forever. And eventually things catch up. And this is what's happened with Ukraine. It's an artificial phenomenon that's been pumped up. It's been, and it's corrupt, is the corruption that has been engendered because of all the Western money that's been injected into this country is literally fatal for civil society, for government, for civil life, business. It's if everyone I've spoken to from Ukraine and also experts in the field have said the corruption is much worse now. And this stands to reason. Whenever you inject a lot of free money into any situation in any country or society, it always breeds corruption.
Yeah.
It's just a fact of life.
We certainly saw that in Afghanistan, and the same absence of guardrails or any accountability or even visibility. I mean, how could it be any other way? And I'm sure that's the case here. And the thing about all the stuff you just said there, which is just so egregious to me and has been for a long time, is that by continuing to fund the fiction that Ukraine could ever have a chance to win, all it's doing is just building hundreds of thousands of graveyards in Ukraine. And it's just so egregious to watch. And like you said, though, that may be coming to an end because Trump is pushing the envelope here and saying, I want this over with really quickly. In the last few minutes we have here, I want to have you comment on something that's on your website that you have written on 21wire.com. Rational Trump, toxic Zelensky, and shackled EU. Key takeaways from the Putin interview. We've talked about what the West has said. We've talked about what the Europeans have said, Zelensky has said in some cases. But you're talking here about something that Putin said. And in a minute, I'm going to ask if you can just kind of talk generally about some of the things you said and what does that lead you to believe about how this is going to end. But I wanted to zero in on this point number 4 that you made here because I thought that first paragraph was really eye-opening to me. Putin responded positively to Trump's proposal to cut defense spending, indicating Moscow's openness to negotiations. We are not against it. The idea is good. U.S. cuts by 50%. We cut by 50%. And if China wants to join us later, that's cool. The fact that Russia would even be talking about defense cuts here just really undercuts the argument that so many in the Western Europe are making, that we have to keep this war going because otherwise, my God, they're going to come after us and he's going to roll all the way. Zelensky's been telling this forever that if we fall, all of Europe is going to fall and all this kind of stuff. And yet here's Putin saying, hey, by the way, once we get this war off the table, I'm cool talking about military cuts here, defense spending cuts. I'm interested in going back to the START treaty because that's going to expire in about a year. We need to work on that kind of thing. Things that are going to endure long-term, things that lead to security in Western and Central Europe for that matter. Why do people not pay as much attention to that part? Why is that not on Western radar screens?
Yeah, this is important. That text came from a Russian news agency, but it's good that they're having this conversation. Okay, it's maybe not realistic. I wouldn't sign anything with the U.S. given the record of the last 4, 8, or 10 years. But they're opening the door. And so any talk in defense cuts is going to be preceded by probably negotiations or treaties for arms reduction, or a new ABM style treaty for anti-ballistic missiles, allaying the fears of Russia's security on their doorstep, that kind of thing. And then you can get into talking about international deals between the major powers on defense cuts. But I think it's in the gray area. It'll be very difficult to nail down, because that's not necessarily always going to be an executive decision. This is going to be a congressional consensus, as it will be with China. It's going to be a big party discussion that they might have a conclave that lasts months to make such decisions. And Russia has a huge national security conclave that has to convene to create these types of consensuses. So, but that's not the point. The point is they're talking about it. That means the chances for an INF, an ABM treaty, a New START treaty, the door's open. That's what's important. And hopefully, if you get the right negotiators, and Trump has the right skilled people that have good subject area expertise on this, that they will be able to move forward with Moscow with some kind of a binding agreement. You don't have the Pompeos in there. You don't have the Boltons in there. They do have an opportunity to actually do something that will endure, as you said, Daniel. So I think it's just so positive that they're even opening that discussion. Where it leads to, it's not clear yet, but they're
That's like you said, it's a step one, and it did be a multi-year process under any circumstance. But I mean, even Reagan's operation started with a talk and a conversation with Gorbachev. So that's something that can be very much positive. I'm all for. Just a few minutes left here. What else from that article there do you think was important to pass along that people need to know about?
Well, I mean, the main thing is just Russia reiterating that they regard Zelensky as a problem, as an impediment to having any stability or any elections. They're calling him, I think Putin used the term, a destabilizing force or something like that, call it a destabilizing factor. So Zelensky's the problem, but he's the one that's being pumped up as the superhero, to take the words straight from the Danish leader, the superhero in the West. He's just a caricature. The green T-shirt. This is like, the green T-shirt, the jumper. This gag has been going for 3 years. If he promises to wear a suit, Russia should invite him to the negotiations. If he promises to wear a suit and tie, then he's invited. That's what I would put out for Kyiv.
Well, we'll certainly see how that turns out. Trump said from the White House yesterday he thought this war could reach a negotiated end within 2 or 3 weeks. So, man, I hope that's the case. They had been talking, after initially saying it's going to be, 1 day or even before I get office, it's going to be done. And then all of a sudden it turned into, well, it's a little longer. And then, okay, well, actually 100 days. Well, now it's backed off. Now it's back into the shorter range. So I hope that means that with Putin anyway, he's getting closer to make a deal, because that would, thrill me to no end to see the killing on the Ukraine side come to an end. And that's what drives us here at Daniel Davis Deep Dive has from the beginning. And we appreciate you coming on and giving us your insights today. And because I know you share that goal of seeing the war come to an end. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Daniel.
And we thank you all too. And just to let you know, here coming up shortly, we have Doug McGregor is going to be coming on saying, well, what could possible peace in Ukraine, what could it actually look like? Not just the caricatures, not just what some people say they want, but what's really possible. Doug is going to kind of help us break some of that down. You're not going to want to miss that. 3:30 p.m. Eastern time, U.S. Time today. So tune in with us then. You won't want to miss that. Thank you very much. And we'll see you shortly on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.